Hello and welcome to Vibrant Lives podcast, formerly Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast dedicated to health and well-being, featuring interviews with experts in the fields of nutrition, physical health and mental health, and my 5-minute food facts series. I am Amanda Hayes, your host, a lawyer turned nutritionist with a deep curiosity about living a healthy, active and fulfilling life, which I would call a vibrant life, and sharing with you what I learn in this podcast. I will note that, although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Vibrant Lives podcast is not intended to be used to treat or cure injuries or medical conditions, and it is never a substitute for advice from your own health professional. Today I will be speaking with Sarah Gauci, scientific researcher and PhD candidate at the Centre of Human Psychopharmacology at Swinburne University in Melbourne. Sarah's PhD research area of interest is investigating the relationship between different dietary patterns and cognitive performance in older adults, in particular cognitive decline. And to give you some context around our conversation, a common form of cognitive decline that just about everyone has heard of is dementia. Dementia is characterised by gradual impairment of the brain's functions, and this can include things like memory, speech, cognition, mobility, and an individual's behaviour. As the disease progresses, a person's functional ability and health declines. In 2017, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, dementia was the second leading cause of death, and it is expected to affect over 500,000 people by 2030. It is therefore undoubtedly an important area of ongoing research, and the more information we can find out about dementia and how to possibly prevent it or treat it, the better. And that's where my conversation with Sarah comes in. Hi Sarah, welcome to Vibrant Lives podcast. Sarah, you've completed a Bachelor of Science majoring in psychology and psychophysiology. I hope I said that right. And in 2017, you completed your honours in psychology. So I think a really good place to start our conversation today would be for you to explain to us what the study of psychophysiology is all about.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is.
Psychophysiology. I think towards the end of my degree, my parents just figured out how to say it after the 4 years. So what I was drawn to psychophys because it's a combination of both biology and psychology. Mm-hmm. So it's really a study of how the mind and the body are connected, and how you can measure the physiological signals of the brain to better understand how it works. So it uses things like MRI and EEGs that pick up on the electrical activity of the neurons and the more functional side as well as the physiological side. So it's a combination of the biology and the mental processes and why we behave the way we do and how we think.
Wow, that sounds really fascinating. And so then you obviously use those skills and have moved on to doing a PhD at the Centre of Psychopharmacology, another long word, at Swinburne University in Melbourne. And you are investigating the relationship between different dietary patterns and cognitive performance in older adults. Before we dive into that, I'd just really like to know what sparked your interest in this area in particular.
So I think, as I said before, I was always really interested in science and the brain. And I think it's such a fascinating area of research that we still really know so little about. So we're always learning new things about the brain. And it's such a complex organ that I think we'll probably forever still be learning new things about it. So I was always interested in maybe being able to better understand why things go wrong in the brain and why some people develop certain disorders and others don't. And I remember being in undergrad and one of my tutors was doing their PhD on a lifestyle intervention for cognitive decline. Specifically, they were looking at physical activity. And I thought that was such a really interesting way to look at it. I had previously heard a lot about, pharmacological interventions and how they're specifically not being super effective, not actually working the way they're supposed to. So I thought it'd be really interesting to understand the different lifestyle interventions that we can do.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating area of research, because the thing about a lifestyle intervention is pretty much anyone can do it. Whereas with a pharmacological intervention, as you say, they haven't been as effective as we've hoped, certainly from what I understand. I know there's been a lot of research into Alzheimer's disease, but there's still no cure or real understanding, I think, of what the actual causes are.
Yeah. And I guess lifestyle intervention is something that's accessible to everybody, but also from an economical point of view, it's cheaper to run it and actually implement these interventions. If everybody has access to changing their diet or exercising more, so it's something that you can actually implement on a large scale.
Yeah, so on that note, we're going to be talking today about the growing research between dietary patterns and cognitive performance. And as you say, it can be implemented by everyone. So it's relevant, I think, to people of all ages. You are specifically looking at the population of older Australians. And I'd just like to quickly put that in context for our listeners. The Australian population as a whole is ageing because we have a sustained low fertility rate and increasing life expectancy. And over the 20 years between 1999 and 2019, the proportion of the population aged 65 and over increased from 12.3% to 15.9%. And during that same period, the number of people over 85 increased by 117% compared with a total population growth of 34.8%. So the population is aging, and that goes hand in hand with cognitive decline, which disproportionately affects older Australians. And I talked about that a bit in the introduction. Let's set the scene with understanding what cognitive decline means. What does that mean in a scientific context?
So as we get older, our cognitive abilities naturally begin to decline. I'm sure we're all familiar with having someone in our family who you notice starting to naturally start to forget things as they get older. The main areas that naturally decline with age are things like processing speed, so how fast we are able to process information from our environment and how fast we're able to use that information from our environment to do the things we need to do. But it's not all bad news. Not all areas of cognitive decline naturally decline with age. So there are areas often referred to as our crystallized abilities that include our knowledge of facts and our vocabulary that seem to be stable as we get older, unless we start to develop those clinical forms of cognitive decline like dementia. And what I'm specifically really interested in is why some people, stay relatively cognitively intact as they get older, and why some people develop those clinical disorders like Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
How, in a clinical context, can you test for that?
So there are a variety of different ways we measure cognition and cognitive performance and cognitive decline. There are some global assessments that often capture an overview of someone's cognitive health. An example of this is called the mini mental state exam.
Oh, yes, I've heard of that.
Yes, and that one's just a really short assessment that asks people a series of very straightforward questions. So it asks people, what's the day today? And what season are we in? And it's a very quick way to be able to capture if someone is experiencing those more progressive stages of cognitive decline. However, because that's such a global measure and it's not very sensitive to the small subtleties that we see with aging, we also have computerized assessment batteries that we can use to pick up more subtle skills. So one way we do that is, as I said, using computerized test batteries that often feel like sitting at a computer game. So you have a button box and a computer screen that will tell you a task, and participants have to respond to that task as quickly and as accurately as they can. And we can pick up how fast, so their response rate, their processing speed, and how accurate they are at those tasks.
Right. I wonder if being nervous would affect that.
Yeah, it does. And one way we get over that is often in our studies, we have a practice session. So they come in, they sit through a practice run of all the assessments. So that way they become familiarized, particularly with older generations who may not have ever held a button box with this sort of like a PlayStation remote, to get familiar with completing those tasks. So that removes some of the practice effects, but also some of the effects of feeling a bit nervous.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So what are then some of the risk factors for cognitive decline?
So there's a variety of different risk factors. We have non-modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline. So these include things like our genetics. So there are a type of genes that we carry that can increase our risk of developing cognitive decline and dementia. One of these genes is called ApoE allele 4. If you're a carrier of this gene, it doesn't mean that you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease. It just means that you're at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Another non-modifiable risk factor is age. So as you said before, getting older is just a natural risk factor of developing these cognitive disorders. So the older you get, the more likely and the higher risk you are of having impaired cognition. So those two risk factors, we can't really currently alleviate or change the risk. But there are many modifiable risk factors that we can. And currently, we are understanding that these modifiable risk factors account for about 35% of the risk of developing cognitive decline. So, one of the early modifiable risk factors is education. So it's something that we can't modify once you get older, but we can modify in making sure education is accessible to all for future generations. So it's something that reduces risk in later life if you are educated. Other risk factors include health things like smoking. So smoking increases risk. Something that we often I never really thought about as hearing loss. So treating hearing loss reduces risk of later life cognitive disorders. Comorbid disorders like depression increase risk, and being isolated and increases risk. But then we have things that are like health factors like cardiovascular health and metabolic health increase risk, and these are particularly important at middle age. So looking after your cardiovascular health and screening for these things in midlife is important for later life cognitive health. And then things that we can easily change and modify, like physical activity and diet, are also really important factors for later life cognitive and mental health as well.
The good news listening to that is that because there are so many modifiable risk factors, that's a large scope then for interventions in all of those areas, which is precisely what you're doing. And when it comes to one of those interventions, which could be dietary patterns, what do we currently know about dietary patterns and cognitive performance?
So it's an area that's really growing in research interest. And I think it's because of the stuff we talked about earlier, that it's, economically makes sense. It's accessible to all. And it's something that, everybody has to eat. So it's something that we can all work on changing. And it also impacts other areas of health. So there are multiple benefits of changing your diet. But we still don't know everything. And a lot of the research the findings are mixed. So some are finding that these healthy dietary patterns do related to better cognitive performance, while others aren't finding those significant effects, which could be due to a variety of different reasons, like the sample and how diet is measured, and people often are biased in reporting what they eat, so they're more likely to say that they have a healthy diet than they are to say that they have an unhealthy diet. Overall, though, what I think is really promising is that there isn't one dietary pattern that's healthier or better than others. The main research is showing that more traditional dietary patterns, those that are high in fruits and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, good fats like olive oil and fatty fish, and diets that are low in red meat and processed food, those things that have the refined sugars. So it's those traditional diets, like the most common one researched, the Mediterranean diet, but also diets like the Nordic and Okinawan diet that seem to be the ones that show the most evidence. And it's just, or what I like to say, is just common sense. So the stuff we know about what we should be eating and what we shouldn't be eating, and that's what's showing to have good effects on brain health.
Yeah, well, that certainly makes sense. And that makes me think of the research about the blue zones. You mentioned Okinawa and how a lot of people there, not so much currently, I believe, but in the past, lived for a long time in very good health.
Yeah, so it's those type of diets, and these dietary patterns that are finding to have good cognitive health, they're also like really related to good cardiovascular health and lower mortality rates. So a diet that's good for your brain is also good for your physiological health in general.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, as you say, those things often go hand in hand. So it's hard to, as a researcher, I imagine it's hard to sort of tease out the difference between people who eat a healthy diet are also more likely in general to have a more active lifestyle. And so it's a package of things, I think, isn't it?
I think it's also that's something that needs to be teased out more and more research. So particularly with the Mediterranean diet, a lot of the effects are not being repeated outside of the Mediterranean area. And that may be because it's not just the diet, it's the lifestyle. So having, that family-orientated meals, eating as a group, having that social interaction, but also having that more laid-back lifestyle with the, siestas in the afternoon and those type of things that might come with the whole package that might be important.
Oh, right. That's really interesting. Because there's so much press about, follow the Mediterranean diet, but I hadn't actually considered that aspect of it, taking it out of the context of, the other lifestyle factors that go hand in hand with it. So in your PhD, let's talk about that. Tell us about what you're doing and how you're conducting the studies.
So for my PhD, I'm looking at baseline data from clinical trials. So it's the data that we collect on their first visit. So we ask them about their diet. So we get them to fill in either food frequency questionnaires that participants report how often they eat certain foods. Or in another study, we get participants to fill out 24-hour diet recalls multiple times across the study. So that gets a more detailed representation of what people eat, because you're less likely to be biased when reporting what you ate yesterday than when you're reflecting what you ate over the last year, which is what we do in food frequency questionnaires. Mm-hmm. And we also get participants to fill in a number of questionnaires at their visits. So asking about their mood, health and well-being, physical activity, so we can control for those effects. We take a variety of different blood samples to be able to measure their nutrient status at baseline. Mm-hmm. So in one study, we're measuring their omega-3 levels, as well as their comorbid stuff. So like their cholesterol levels, glucose, and we also measure their cardiovascular health. So measure their blood pressure, but also their arterial stiffness. So we do these trials, and I'm using the baseline data usually to see an effect of an intervention. Mm-hmm. One of the trials that I've worked on for the last couple of years with my colleague Lauren is looking at an effect of a multivitamin. So what was really interesting with how we recruited participants for that study was that, as I said earlier, we seem to find that participants who are interested in health and want to participate tend to be more aware of what's good for them, and therefore already eating a healthy diet or being physically active. So what Lauren designed when she was designing this clinical trial was a way to try and target people with both healthy diets but also unhealthy diets, to try and get a more representative sample. And as expected, it was really hard to get those people with those unhealthy diets to enroll in the study. So we filled in the optimal diet group really quickly, but it took us a lot longer to recruit those people who ate more unhealthy foods, whether it was because they weren't reporting them or because often if they did have an unhealthy diet, they often had a comorbid disorder that would make them ineligible for the trial.
Right. And also they may not want to put their diet under the spotlight if they're...
Yes.
So when you're talking about the participants, what age group were you looking at?
So I am really interested in aging populations, but specifically from middle age to older, I think. So in one of the trials that I'm using the data from, they're 65 years plus. So that's more of an aging population. And in the study with the different dietary patterns, so the optimal and suboptimal participants, that was 45 to 65 years.
Okay.
And specifically with that one, I'm interested in seeing if diet is important for cognitive health at middle age. Most of the evidence out there shows that it is important for cognitive health, but they're in people who are already aged or older. So I did a bit of a review of the literature and found that there are not that many studies that look at different dietary patterns in middle age. And when they do assess different dietary patterns in middle age, they often don't measure cognition at the same time. So they'll assess their diet at 45, and then 20 years down the time, they'll assess their cognition. Right. And then they'll say that they're related, but it's a bit hard when you're not assessing them together. Yeah, that makes sense. I just want to jump ahead and ask one quick question. Yes.
Is it too late to start eating? Is it ever too late, to start eating a better diet?
That's a bit of a hard one. I don't. My personal opinion is no. I think we know that diet's really important for all varieties of health. But a lot of the risk factors, such as cardiovascular health and metabolic health, seem to be really important in middle age. So I think that's a time where it's really important to focus on lowering the risk of those disorders to lower the risk of later life cognitive decline. But there are intervention studies showing effects as people get older as well. So in answer, I would say no, it's probably never too late.
Never too late. The reason I'm interested in that particular question is because I believe that our brain health is influenced by our cumulative lifestyle habits. And one you mentioned earlier was education. So you would imagine that a long-term healthy dietary pattern is better overall than becoming healthy when you're 45. I guess that's just common sense though, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, in the ideal world, we'll eat healthier all the time. Yeah. But I guess food isn't, that's not the only reason why we eat food. So we also eat food to enjoy it and be social. So we can't always be healthy 100% of the time, and that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So when you are looking at the diets and going a bit more into the nitty-gritty, what are some of the elements of the Mediterranean, for example, diet that contribute, you think, to cognitive health?
There is a lot of research out there looking at the specific components. I think it's important to note that obviously a diet is a complex interaction between the different components. So increasing one thing might not specifically have the benefit. It's the combination. Yeah. But olive oil is a really prominent feature of the Mediterranean diet. It's rich in monosaturated fatty acids and polyphenols, and there's a lot of evidence that these are benefit for cardiovascular health and therefore brain health. Another key component is, the omega-3 fatty acids. So those oily fish are a really prominent feature of the Mediterranean diet, and therefore it's showing a lot of promise with cognitive health. And there's a lot of cross-sectional evidence with omega-3 status and later life cognitive health. However, this hasn't been translating in the clinical trials with omega-3 supplementation. And that could be from a variety of different reasons. Yeah. It could be the, complex interactions with whole diets, but also we might not be knowing what level or amount of omega-3s is important in combination with other aspects of the diet.
Yeah, I think some of the takeaways from scientific studies that come to my mind are that it's often the whole food that is better than, say, an isolated element of it. Like, for example, taking a vitamin C pill. We don't eat, in quotes, vitamin C. We might eat an orange that contains vitamin C and all sorts of other things that must, work in combination to contribute to our health.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. It's not, no single nutrient acts in isolation. They work together. Yeah. And I think that's why I'm particularly interested in whole diets. So yes. There's that complex interaction between all the different food groups and nutrients taking place that then influence these effects on health and then cognition.
If you were advising a friend who was approaching middle age, what are the things they could do apart from diet, so in addition to diet, to maintain their cognitive health?
So when we were talking about the risk factors, I mentioned physical activity. So that's something that's really important for cognitive health. So trying to maintain that level of activity. There's also a lot of research out there about keeping cognitively active as well. So, picking up new skills or trying to learn new things into old age is something that's really important. So just keeping active, both physically and mentally, as well as eating well, seem to be really important.
And social activity, you mentioned that as well, is another important thing, to be engaged, isn't it, in a community or with friends, family.
I guess that's something really relevant at the moment with, being in lockdown and isolation. Yes. That could have these effects on cognition later in time.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting thing to watch the progression of the impact that these lockdowns have had on. I mean, there's a lot of, noise in the media that it's going to have a detrimental effect on our young people. I mean, hopefully it doesn't, but I guess we'll have to wait and see, won't we?
Yes.
What comes of it all. So if we then just sort of flip this on our head and have a look at what would be perhaps some of the outcomes of eating a diet which we would consider unhealthy. So a diet that's very high in processed food and takeaway food, sugary drinks, low in fiber. Can a diet like that impact cognitive health?
Yeah, it's something that I'm really interested in, and I am looking at those type of diets as well in my PhD. And I think there's been a bit of a gap in the research focusing mainly on healthy diets. And it's quite unfortunate because that's not what the predominant Australian diet is. So on average, we know Australians aren't consuming or eating according to the dietary recommendations. Yeah. So just for looking at vegetables alone, I think it's around 6% of Australians eat the recommended amount of vegetables. So they're not adhering to a Mediterranean diet or the Australian dietary guidelines. They're probably more likely to adhere to a Western style diet that is one that's higher in processed foods, refined sugars, red meat, processed meats, more likely to have those takeout foods, or things that are lower in fiber and higher in salts and saturated fats. And of the research out there, it does seem to have an impact on cognitive health. These diets tend to be high inflammatory diets, so they increase inflammation, and that is known to have an effect on brain health. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the proposed mechanisms. But we know that these diets are also bad for cardiovascular health and metabolic health. And one of the key risk factors we're finding is glucose control. So developing diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, really increases the risk of cognitive decline and developing dementia later in life. And we know there are strong correlations between diet and type 2 diabetes. So it's not promising information about those diets. But a really interesting study did find that diets seem to interact. So we do, on average, most people would not just eat processed foods or foods that are low in that. They might eat a combination.
Yeah.
So they might have takeout one day and a really healthy meal on the other day. And it seems to be that as long those foods might interact and the healthy might outweigh the unhealthy, we hope. So more research needs to be done. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because, as you say, we're often studying what we want or think is the optimal diet, whereas it's important to also study what is actually happening in the population, because from there we can then work out perhaps how to make changes that will be beneficial. Sarah, you also, another area of interest of yours is the potential for dietary interventions for cognition and mood. So could you talk to us a little bit about that, and what are, for example, some of the foods that are known to boost our mood or our cognition?
So there are lots of different research about specific food groups. An interesting diet that was developed combining a lot of the evidence for the Mediterranean diet and a diet called the DASH diet, which was developed for cardiovascular health. They developed the MIND diet, and this diet seems to combine those two diets, focusing on the neuroprotective components. And what they found in developing that dietary pattern is that instead of fruits in general, they seem to find that berries was really cardio and cognitively protective. So things like, blueberries, strawberries, and those type of things were really important in that diet for cognitive health. Other really important components they found were leafy greens. In addition to vegetables, so specifically increasing those dark leafy greens in the diet was really important. So I guess dietary intervention, I'm really interested in that, is maybe we could increase certain areas of our diet that might have a better impact for cognitive health. But yeah, it's always that whole diet approach that's really important.
Yeah, that is very interesting, isn't it? That an actual food or food group can have a real impact on how you feel. So we should all eat our berries and our leafy greens.
Yes, I think, yeah. And berries are really tasty. So
they
it's
are.
a nice
they
treat.
are. I have it's a hard sell in my household to try and get kale on the table, I must say. Not a popular.
I'm not a massive fan myself.
No, I haven't met many people who are, to be honest. But anyway, there are lots of other alternatives to kale when it comes to leafy greens.
That's true. And disguising them is a good way. I like to pop my spinach in my smoothie with the berries.
Yes, exactly. And the berries, the flavour of the berries is stronger than the spinach. So
yes,
you can disguise it, as you say. Sarah, you're also very interested and passionate about scientific communication and disseminating what you learn to the general public. And I think that's really important. What are some of the ways, apart from going on my podcast, that you use to communicate with the public about what you're doing?
Yeah. I think it's really important, mainly because I think there's so much information out there, and often this information online and like on things like Instagram and social media can come from non-scientific basis. So it's really important to make sure people are getting information that comes from science and is actually scientifically proven to be important. And some of the ways I do that is I like to be active on Twitter. I think Twitter is a really good way to quickly communicate information.
Yes.
But I also would really like to get involved with, presenting and talking to the community. So things like being on this podcast. I've done 20 PhDs in 20 minutes.
Oh, great. Yeah.
That one. So that was a really fun way to do it. But yeah, I'm always open to trying to get other ways. I think last year I was involved in the online component of Pint of Science. I was, and I'd love to be able to present in person, hopefully in the future, something similar like that.
I was just about to say, have you heard of that? Which you obviously have. I interviewed Emma Beckett last year, and she was involved in Pint of Science as well.
Yeah, I think it's such a great initiative to get, science out into like the sort of general public, and you get to hear about so many interesting different areas of research.
Yeah, I think it's vital actually, because as you say, there's a lot of information available, and some of it's not necessarily credible. So it's good to have an understanding of where your information is coming from and being aware of what you can trust in terms of the accuracy and credibility.
And even I think it's important, I'm not sure how I would do this, but I think it's important in general that people we need to be able to skill build the general public on how to understand the information they're getting and how to know that information comes from a credible source or not. It's so easy to read something that sounds right and be like, yeah, that sounds about right, and not be able to understand that you don't need to, cut out all carbohydrates to lose weight.
Yeah. It's I think it's a really confusing space out there, nutrition in particular.
Yes.
And that is one of my motivations in doing this podcast, is to try and sort of cut through the noise a bit and understand where credible information comes from and how the public can access that.
Yes, definitely.
So, Sarah, to wrap up, who or what inspires you?
That's a bit of a difficult question, but I think I'm really inspired by working with people, talking to people about research like this. I think it's really inspiring, and I get really excited usually after having those collaborative meetings where you're just talking about research ideas. And after those meetings, I tend to feel a little bit full of energy and ready to go, and really excited and inspired by that. So I really love working with peers and researchers with similar mindsets and similar research interests. But I'm also inspired by, my family, my friends. I wouldn't be who I am without them, and I am forever grateful for the upbringing I have from my parents. So I think that's been a really inspiring journey for me.
Yeah, that's lovely. And obviously your parents have provided you with excellent opportunities to, have a good education and continue on with that.
Yeah, so. Both my parents didn't finish high school. My dad didn't even go to high school. My mum finished, I think, in year 8. But for them, I think education was important. But what was more important was for me to do things that I enjoy and not ever felt pressure to do well in school. As long as I was happy, that was the main thing. And I think that was a really important aspect for me, because I think there's so much pressure out there to do well, but
yes,
it should be putting pressure for children to find something that they enjoy, and that therefore if you enjoy it, you tend to do well at it.
Absolutely. And you're a case in point, Sarah. And Sarah, the final question I like to ask all my guests, if you could recommend 2 things that people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be?
I guess it's 2 really important things, I think, is try and find ways, I think, about if we're talking about eating better or being, physically active, try and find ways to incorporate those behaviors into things you enjoy. I think nothing ever sticks if it's a chore.
Yep.
You're not going to eat well if you force yourself to do something. But if you try and incorporate things you enjoy into those things. So if you enjoy cooking, spend a lot of time planning out your meals and try and incorporate new foods, because we know variety is really important. Do that. But if you don't enjoy cooking, healthy foods doesn't have to always be complicated. You can make it simple. And if you enjoy being outside, go outside to do your exercise or be outside to grow your own veggies. I know it's never that simple, but I think trying to find ways you enjoy is really important.
Yeah.
And finally, I think it's important not to feel guilty about not being healthy all the time, or not sticking to your, super Mediterranean diet. I guess chocolate is nice and we all enjoy it. It's okay to occasionally eat it.
Yes, I agree. We have to have a balance in our lives, don't we? And
yes.
Enjoy ourselves.
Yes.
Enjoy our friends and family.
100%. There's more to life and there's more to food than just, eating for our cognitive health.
Yeah. Yeah. But hopefully if you're enjoying yourself and being social and having meals with families, it's even if sometimes you might have a treat, it's all working towards the same goal.
Yes, I think that's what the research might be showing us.
And Sarah, if people want to follow you, you mentioned Twitter before, what is the best way for them to do that?
So my handle on Twitter is Sarah R. Gauci. Gauci, and I have a website where I have a bit of information about my research as well, which is sarah-gauci.com. I'd like, hopefully those are the main areas that I sort of post on and keep active with my research, and I have a list of my publications on my website as well.
Excellent. So I'll put links to those in the show notes. So Sarah, thank you very much for coming on Vibrant Lives podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. This has been really wonderful. It's, as I said, I get really inspired talking to people about research and these type of things. So it's been a great experience.
Thank you. And that was scientific researcher and PhD candidate Sarah Gauci discussing the relationship between different dietary patterns and cognitive performance in older adults. Thank you for listening today. I do hope you found my discussion with Sarah interesting and hopefully relevant as well. If you did, please share the podcast and tell your friends about it. And if you could take a minute to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, it will help people find my podcast. If you would like to subscribe to Vibrant Lives podcast, you can subscribe on all good podcast providers like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Google Podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Please follow me on Instagram and Facebook. I'll put links in the show notes, and DM me with any topics you'd like to learn more about. Producing the podcast is a labour of love. It has become my full-time job, and I do devote a lot of time, energy, and money towards the podcast. So if you would like to support it, I would be really grateful. There are several ways you can do that, but one of the easiest ways is to go to my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com, and you can buy a book from the book reviews page, and as an Amazon associate, I get a small commission. Alternatively, you can make a donation via the donations page on my website. Thank you very much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.